Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making such audiobooks for you. The Muslim Conquest of Persia by Lieutenant General A.I. Akram. This book tells in detail about the Arab conquest of Persia, also known as the Arab conquest of Iran, during the Rashidun Caliphate from 633 to 654 AD. This conquest brought the fall of the Sassanid Empire, which was in power for over 4 centuries, while rivaling its neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantine. Start of Chapter 21. The Fall of Persia. We are nearing the end of this history. Although in terms of geography more than half the Persian Empire had yet to be conquered, the most interesting campaigns and the most important battles are behind us. The war would go on and Persia would resist the Muslim advance from city to city, from province to province, until the last of the Persians would submit to the inexorable decree of fate. But Nihawand took the wind out of Persia's sails. The fate of Persia was sealed, and if Persia fought on, it was because a great people, faced with national subjugation, prolonged their agony through the very pride and stamina which makes them great. We cannot see in detail the operations fought after Nihawand till the final collapse of Persia, because no details are available. The operations which followed Nihawand are not recorded as minutely as operations up to Nihawand. Hence we cannot but be brief in dealing with them. So in this chapter the reader is offered a short summary of the remainder of the war, a bird's-eye view of what for the Muslims was a glorious epic, and for the Persian Empire a painful end. Nihawand was more than a great victory. It was a turning point from which sprang new policies relating to the rule of the conquered territory and further direction of the war. It became clear to the Muslims, as indeed it would have been clear all along, that you cannot walk in and conquer part of a mighty empire and hope that the empire will take its loss philosophically and accept it as permanent. But now the Caliph quite definitely realized this truth and adopted a new direction of political and military policy. The first of these changes related to Muslims acquiring property in Iraq. Umar had laid an embargo upon this. He had regarded the Muslims in Iraq as a standing army, an instrument of holy war, to be kept free of all local attachments. They were maintained in a state of military alert, to take the field at a moment's notice, which would not be possible if they became landowners and acquired a vested interest in property. Ever since his return to Medina from Kufa, Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas had been urging the Caliph to permit the Muslims to settle in the land, but Umar had resisted the pressure. After Nihawand, the climate changed, and the defects in the Caliph's policy were nicely explained by Ashraf bin Qais, a veteran of Iraq. "O Commander of the Faithful," said Ashraf, "you have debarred us from settling in the land, and made us withhold our hands from what we have conquered. But the Emperor of Persia is alive behind them, and they will not cease to contend with us as long as the Emperor is among them. Two kings cannot work together in harmony. One must oust the other. You have seen that we have not taken a city except in countering their moves. It is their emperor who raises them against us, and this will continue until you permit us to settle in their land and push their emperor out of Persia and out of the veneration of his people. Then the people of Persia will give up hope of his help and lose their firmness of purpose. Others present added, this state of affairs will not change until he is driven out of his realm. The wisdom of this opinion was undeniable. The Caliph raised the embargo, and thereafter the Muslims could purchase land in Iraq and become settlers. The next problem was Persia itself. The Caliph's policy of being content with what had been acquired and defending the Muslim conquests by taking the field only when the Persians came forward had not succeeded. During the last 5 years, the Muslims had all along reacted rather than acted. The only way to ensure the safety of the Muslims in Iraq and of Iraq itself was to destroy those Persian forces which threatened Iraq, and this could only be done by taking all of Persia, so that no armed hostile Persians remained. The Muslims already had Iraq, Khuzestan, and most of the district of Kirmanshahan, the last mentioned being like a bridgehead in the Zagros Mountains. What lay immediately ahead of the Muslim front was A. Fars in the south, the province on the Persian Gulf lying southeast of Khuzestan and including the southern reaches of the Zagros. B. Azerbaijan in the north, a tangled mass of mountains where the Zagros and Elburz ranges meet. And C. Isfahan in the middle, east of the Zagros. These three formed clear strategical objectives for further campaigns, and Fars and Isfahan would have to be taken before the Muslims could launch further campaigns on the great Iranian plateau which stretched beyond to Afghanistan and Balochistan. Umar thought a great deal about his next objective. Then he sent for Hormuzan who, as one of the top generals of Persia, would be just the man to advise the Caliph in such matters. Umar told him the problem, then asked, how do you think we should start? With Fars or with Azerbaijan or with Isfahan? Fars and Azerbaijan are the two wings and Isfahan is the head, replied Hormuzan, putting an entire strategy into a few words. If you cut off one wing, the head will stay with the other. But if you cut off the head, the wings will fall, so start with the head. Umar started with the head. There was no time to lose. The decision having been made to invade Persia and take all of it, the ideal moment to strike was now, while Persia was still under the shock of Nehawand. That disaster had caused a kind of paralysis in Persia, from which it would take a long time to recover, and this time Persia was not to be allowed. A few months after Nehawand, during which preparations were made for the offensive, the Caliph ordered the launching of the first of 4 campaigns, which would shatter what remained of Persian resistance and make Persia a part of the Empire of Islam. The very first operation was directed against Isfahan. Sometime in the last quarter of 21 Hijri, Abdullah bin Utban set off with an army from Iraq and, marching via Nehawand, made straight for Isfahan. Some distance short of that city, the Muslim advance guard came up against a large Persian detachment, and a hard-fought action followed in which the Persians were driven back with heavy loss. The Muslims marched on and arrived at Isfahan to find a Persian army formed up for battle at Jay, an outer part of Isfahan, to the east of the city. The Muslims attacked at once, and the defenders withdrew into the fortified part of the city. The Muslims laid siege to Isfahan. This siege had gone on for a few weeks when two more Muslim groups joined Abdullah. One was a large corps under Ahnaf bin Qais, who had been selected by the Caliph for the invasion of Khorasan and was now being positioned at Isfahan, from where he would take off, and the other was a detachment under Abu Musa from Basra. Hardly had these groups arrived when the Persian commander at Isfahan, a general named Fazusfan, offered to decide the issue by single combat with the Muslim commander, the winner taking all. Abdullah agreed, and the two generals met on horseback to fight a duel. The Persian was the first to strike with his sword. The blow did not harm Abdullah, but landed on the front part of his saddle with the result that the saddle broke and slipped off the horse, while Abdullah landed on the ground beside the horse. He was up immediately and jumped onto the bare back of his horse, but the Persian, instead of taking advantage of the vulnerability of his opponent, told him that he was much too good a man to be killed and could have Isfahan in peace. Consequently, Abdullah took Isfahan in peace, and the Persians laid down their arms. Upon the fall of Isfahan, following the instructions of the Caliph, Abu Musa took command of this sector. He marched northwards with a sizable corps and captured Kashan and Qum. These actions were completed by the end of 21 Hijri, and the first part of the campaign successfully concluded. Before its conclusion, Nuaym bin Muqarrin, brother of the victor of Nihawand, had been given his warning orders to march with an army of 12,000 men and take Rai, which with Isfahan was strategically the most important city in the central sector and controlled all movement towards the northeastern part of the empire. On his way, he would have to recapture Hamadan, which had revolted and broken the treaty signed just after Nihawand. In the beginning of 22 Hijri, which began on November 30, 642, his right flank secured by Abu Musa, Nuaym marched from Nihawand to Hamadan. The city was again invested by the Muslims, but only a few days had passed before Khusro Shanum, the commander of Hamadan, surrendered to Nuaym for a second time. Leaving a small detachment at Hamadan to watch the Persians, Nuaym advanced upon Qazwin and at Wajruz, some distance short of Qazwin, came up against a fairly large Persian army under Isfandiar, brother of the late Rustam. A fierce battle followed, which it said was as bloody as Nihawand, and in which the Persians were roundly defeated and driven back, some towards Rai and others towards Azerbaijan. Nuaym sacked Wajruz and marched on to Rai, which he found heavily defended. But the Muslims were able to get inside the fort at night by guile and quickly brought the Persian garrison to its knees. Rai too was sacked and a great deal of booty taken, after which the district came under Muslim rule and agreed to the payment of the jizya. Nuaym established himself firmly at Rai and sent his brother Sowaid to subdue the hilly region to the east, which controlled communications with the northeastern part of the Persian Empire. One by one, Dimawand, Damaghan, and Gurgan fell without resistance before Sowaid. The administrator of each of these districts agreed to a peaceful surrender, and pacts were drawn up, stipulating the payment of the jizya and other terms. Thus practically the whole of Tabaristan, The region, now known as Mazandaran, came under Muslim occupation. It was still early in 22 Hijri. The first campaign was over. A broad wedge had been driven into the center of Persia, severing the north from the south, each of which was now on its own. The head had been cut, but the wings would need a little push before they fell. The wing to be eliminated next was the northern one, Azerbaijan. Sometime after Nehawand, in 21 Hijri, the Caliph had removed Amr bin Yasir from the governorship of Kufa. He had been found to be weak in matters of government and not competent enough to run the province with efficiency. In his place, Umar appointed Mughira bin Shoba, who took over the province and at once improved the tone of the administration. As a Muslim, he did not compare with Umar, who was one of the most venerated companions, but as an administrator, Mughira was clearly in a higher class. Mughira's task was to prepare the campaign against Azerbaijan. Huzaifa bin al-Yaman was appointed by the Caliph to command this theatre, and it was the Caliph's intention to launch him soon after Isfahan was taken, and the two wings of Persia had been severed from one another. But there was some delay. Sufficient troops could not be mustered for the operation, and Umar found it necessary to use some of the troops from the central sector. Thus Noaim got instructions soon after the reconquest of Hamadan to send a large detachment to join Huzaifa, but anticipating heavy fighting in his own sector, Noaim delayed implementation of the Caliph's order until he had taken Rai. Once Rai had fallen, Noaim dispatched the detachment to Huzaifa, and soon after that the campaign was launched. Huzaifa captured Zanjan against opposition and marched on to Ardabil, which surrendered on terms. From here he continued the offensive and got to Bab, a few miles south of Darband. Bab was an important port on the Caspian Sea, where Anushirwan had built a great wall from the shore of the Caspian into the hills of Azerbaijan to keep the marauding Turks out of his empire. Bab surrendered on terms and the Muslims marched on until they got to Mokan, where they defeated a Turkish army. At about this stage of the campaign, Hudayfa was removed from command by order of Umar and replaced by Utbah bin Farqad. Utbah maintained the momentum of the offensive and after a number of tactical actions took all of Azerbaijan up to a little south of Darband and the eastern and northern part of Armenia as far as Tiflis, on the southern slopes of the Caucasus Mountains. During this campaign, only at one place did the Muslims suffer a setback, and that was at Balanjar, between Bab and Darband, where a Muslim corps was badly beaten by the Turks. Otherwise, the Muslim army carried all before it, and by the end of 22 Hijri, had taken its objectives and brought Azerbaijan and most of Armenia under Muslim rule. How far the Muslims marched into western Armenia, which was in Roman hands, is not known, but by this campaign Persian power in the northwestern wing of the empire was totally eliminated. The offensive in Azerbaijan was still in its early stages when the Caliph launched the third campaign, deep in the south of Persia. It had become obvious that Azerbaijan would not prove a tough nut to crack, and it was not necessary to await its fall. The less time the Persians were allowed to recover in the mainland of Persia, the better it would be for the Muslims. It was military wisdom to press on in the east and penetrate as deep as necessary before the Persians regained their balance, and put another large army in the field. Consequently, about the middle of 22 Hijri, Umar decided to strike at the southern wing of Persia. Hormuzan had spoken of Fars as a wing of Persia, but Fars was only the French province bordering Khuzestan. The Muslims would take the entire southern part of the empire, and this would be done with a series of operations by separate corps. The first one to break into the southern part of the empire was Mujash bin Masud. He marched with his corps into the district of Ardshir Khura, and the first battle fought by him was at Tawus, also known as Tawaj, where the Muslims had fought an action in 17 Hijri during the abortive expedition launched across the Persian Gulf by Ula bin al-Hadrami. Mujash defeated a Persian force at Tawus and went on to lay siege to the town of Sabur, 10 miles northwest of Kazirun. In a few weeks, the Persians at Sabur had laid down their arms and submitted to Muslim rule. This was followed by a thrust deeper into Fars by Uthman bin Abil As, starting from where Mujash had left off. Uthman overwhelmed a Persian force at Jor, also known then as Ardshir Khura, and went on to occupy Shiraz and Persepolis, the historic city, the inhabitants of which had been brutally massacred by Alexander the Great. After Persepolis, Saria bin Zunaym led a column into the district of Darabjurd and captured Fasa and Darabjurd, now known as just Darab. After this, Sohail bin Adi, reinforced by Abdullah bin Uthman, who had conquered Isfahan, marched to Kirman. He was faced at the frontier of Kirman by a small Persian army, which he fought and defeated with no difficulty. Following this success, Sohail advanced and occupied Ziraft, and then turned north to take Biman, then Shirjan. The next province to be attacked was Sistan, home of the legendary Rustam of the Shahnama, and here the Muslim commander was Asim bin Amr, our brilliant hero of many campaigns in Iraq. Asim met and scattered a Persian force near the border of Sistan, and then marched on to Zaranj, the present Zahedan, to which he laid siege. The siege had not lasted many days, however, when the Persians surrendered to the Muslims. Only one province remained, Makran, bordering the Sindh, and for this Umar formed a strong corps under Hakam bin Amr, which included the column of Sohail bin Adi, who had taken Kirman. Hakam marched to Makran and, near the bank of a river, came up against an army led by King Rasil of the Sindh. This was the first time that the Muslims had come in hostile contact with India. The position of the river near the bank of which the two armies met is not known, but the presence of an Indian army here suggests that it must have been nearer Sindh than Persia. Quite a fierce battle was fought at this place, and Allah again bestowed victory upon Muslims. The defeated Indians of Raja Rasil withdrew across the river and retreated to the safety of the Sindh. The messenger who brought news of the conquest of Makran to Medina was a bit of a poet. When asked by Umar to describe the country to him, he broke into rhyme. O Commander of the Faithful, it is a land where the plains are hilly, where the water is a trickle, where the fruit is inferior, where the enemy is brave. Its good is short, its evil is long. In it many are few, and the few are helpless, and what lies beyond it is even worse. The Caliph looked intently at the man for a few moments, then asked, "Are you a messenger or a poet?" The man assured the Caliph that he was a messenger, and that what he said was true, whereupon Umar swore, "By Allah, no army of mine will fight there as long as I am in charge." And he at once wrote to Hakam bin Amr to go no further. There was no need to go further, for all of southern Persia was now in Muslim hands, and it was still early in the year 23 Hijri. After the fall of the Persian south, the only region of Persia which remained unconquered was Khurasan, and since the Muslims had determined to leave nothing of Persia under Persian rule, Umar gave Ahnaf bin Qais the order to march. Ahnaf bin Qais was ready at Isfahan. He had taken part in the siege of Isfahan and then assisted Abu Musa in the conquest of Kashan. He chose to avoid the highway which led from Rai to Nishapur because more opposition was likely on this route, and instead struck out across the desert on a less frequented route which bypassed Nishapur and led to Herat. For an Arab force to cross a desert was no problem, and Ahnaf marched on, took Tabas and Don, two big towns between Isfahan and Khurasan. These towns are now named Gulshan and Firdos respectively, and then went on to Herat, leaving Nishapur behind and on his left. The Persians put up stiff resistance at Herat, but were defeated in battle, and Herat opened its gates to the army of Islam. This was the easternmost city of Khurasan. Leaving a garrison at Herat, Ahnaf detached a column to subjugate Nishapur and Tus, which the column did, and with the rest of the army marched north to Marv. Yazjud was at Marv when he heard of the approach of the Muslims, and left it hastily for Balkh, and Ahnaf bin Qais arrived and occupied Marv without opposition. Here he stopped to await the arrival of reinforcements from Iraq. A few weeks later a contingent arrived from Kufa as reinforcements, and upon its arrival Ahnaf advanced to Balkh, the ancient capital of Bactria, 14 miles west of the present Mazar-e-Sharif. Here Yazjud was able to put a small army in the field, consisting of warriors from Transoxiana, also known as Mavra-un-Nahar, but it was trounced by the Muslims and forced to withdraw across the river Oxus, leaving Balkh to the Muslims, who occupied the city peacefully. After signing the usual pact with the local inhabitants, Ahnaf marched back to Marv and made this place his permanent station. Khurasan now belonged to Islam. Upon his return to Marv, in the end of 23 Hijri, Ahnaf sent an account of his operations to the Caliph, mentioning in it the fact that he had got to the Oxus. To the dwellers of Arabia, the bank of the Oxus, known to them as Jaihun, was a very far-away place, beyond which stretched vast unknown spaces, and to Umar it was another river to worry about. He hastily sent orders to Ahnaf that on no account was he to cross the Oxus. The year 23 Hijri was coming to an end. It had been a glorious year. It had seen the frontiers of Islam established far from its birthplace. In the east, Muslim outposts stood on the borders of India, in central Afghanistan and on the river Oxus, while in the west the reach of Islam ran in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Medina was happy. But one man in Medina was not happy, and he walked the streets of the Prophet's city in brooding silence. This man was Firoz the Persian, who had been captured at Nehawand and mourned his misfortune with the bitter complaint, "Umar has eaten my heart." As a slave he had been bought by Mughira bin Shu'bah and now belonged to him. But although Mughira was at Kufa, the slave was in Medina. Why? We do not know. He was a Christian and a very talented man, an engineer, a carpenter, an engraver, and a blacksmith. He worked in Medina and earned money, and as was the custom of the time, had to pay a certain part of his earnings to his master. The amount in question was very little, 2 dirhams a day, but it irked him and added fuel to his hatred of the Muslims, who were the cause of his being a slave. In a street of the city this man, whom the Arabs called Abu Lulu, father of the pearl, met the Caliph. "O Commander of the Faithful," he said, "help me against Mughira bin Shu'bah. He has placed too heavy a tax on me." "How much is the tax on you?" asked the Caliph. "2 dirhams a day." "And what kind of work can you do?" "I am a carpenter, an engraver, and a blacksmith." "In that case," said Umar, "I do not see the tax as too high, in view of the things you can do. I have heard that you have said that you could construct a windmill." "I shall make you a windmill," boasted the Persian, "about which people will talk in the East and the West." The windmill which the Persian had in mind was not the kind of windmill which the Caliph wanted. The following day, Ka'b the rabbi came to Umar and said, "O Commander of the Faithful, make your bequests, for you will be dead in 3 days." "How do you know that?" "I have found it in the Book of Allah, the Torah." "You have found Umar bin al-Khattab in the Torah?" asked the Caliph incredulously. "O Lord, no, but I have found your description, and your time has come." The next day Ka'b the rabbi came to Umar and said, "O Commander of the Faithful, 1 day has gone and 2 days are left." The following day he came again. "2 days are gone, and a day and a night are left," he said. "They are yours till the morning." The following morning Umar went to the mosque for the prayer of the dawn. For a few minutes he saw to the dressing of the ranks, then took his place in front to lead the prayer as Imam. At that moment, Abu Lulu rushed through the ranks of the faithful with a dagger. He got to the Caliph and struck him in the belly. Frantic with rage, he struck again and again. After the 6th blow, the huge frame of Umar collapsed on the floor. Near him stood a Muslim named Kulayb bin Abi Amr, and he came forward to grapple with the assassin, but he too was stabbed and mortally wounded. Then Abu Lulu ran out of the mosque with the dripping dagger in his hand. He was pursued and overpowered. 3 days later, on Zulhajj 26, 23 Hijri, that is November 2nd or 3rd, 644 AD, Umar son of al-Khattab, Caliph of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, commander of the faithful, breathed his last. Upon the death of Umar, his son Ubaidullah, whom Umar had once had whipped for drinking, took the law into his own hands in complete disregard of the processes of justice, went and killed Abu Lulu, Abu Lulu's wife and Abu Lulu's daughter. Next he killed another Persian Christian living in Medina, Jufaina by name, and then went after Hormuzan, the Persian general whose life had been spared by Umar, and who had become a Muslim and settled in Medina. Ubaidullah approached Hormuzan quietly from behind, sword in hand, but the Persian glanced back and saw him, and before the fatal blow landed, declared, "There is none worthy of worship except Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." End of chapter 21.